Beyond the boundaries of our world, some stories define what it means to be human. This is Of the World, Missions Beyond Earth. July 20th, 1969. A spacecraft the size of 2 telephone booths is falling toward the moon at 3,000 miles per hour. Inside, 2 men, with less computing power than a modern calculator, are trying to land on another world for the first time in human history. They have 60 seconds of fuel remaining. An alarm is screaming, and mission control has gone silent. This is the story of Apollo 11. To understand why 2 Americans stood on the moon in 1969, you have to understand the terror that put them there. On October 4th, 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, a polished metal sphere the size of a beach ball, into orbit around the Earth. It did nothing but beep, but that beep was heard in every capital, every military command center, and every living room in America. If the Soviets could put a satellite over American skies, they could put a nuclear warhead there too. The space race was never really about space, it was about survival. On April 12, 1961, Yuri Gagarin became the first human to orbit the Earth. The Soviet Union had beaten America again. 6 weeks later, President John F. Kennedy stood before Congress and issued the most audacious challenge in the history of exploration. I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. America had 8 years, almost no technology to do it, and a space program that had managed exactly 15 minutes of crewed spaceflight. Everything about Apollo was impossible, and the most impossible part was the rocket. The Saturn V was the largest, most powerful machine ever built by human hands. It stood 363 feet tall, taller than the Statue of Liberty. It weighed 6.2 million pounds fully fueled. Its 5 F1 engines generated 7.5 million pounds of thrust, enough power to lift a fully loaded Navy destroyer off the ground. No rocket before it had ever come close. No rocket since has matched it. The fuel burned at a rate of 15 tons per second. At ignition, the sound was so violent that it killed birds a mile away and could be felt as a physical pressure wave in the chests of spectators 3 miles from the pad. This was the machine that would carry 3 men to the moon. July 16, 1969. 9:32 in the morning, Eastern Daylight Time, Kennedy Space Center, Pad 39A. 1 million spectators lined the beaches and highways of Florida. 600 million people, 1/5 of the world's population, watched on television. Presidents, senators, and astronauts' families held their breath. 10, 9, ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engines running. Liftoff. We have liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff on Apollo 11. The Saturn V rose on a column of flame so bright it turned night into day. The ground shook, the air cracked, and humanity began its longest journey. For 3 days, Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins coasted through the void, 240,000 miles of empty space between the Earth and the Moon. They watched the Earth shrink from a continent-spanning horizon to a blue marble hanging in infinite black. Collins later described it as fragile, small, not the domain of astronauts, but of poets. Inside the command module Columbia, the 3 men lived in a space smaller than a minivan. They ate freeze-dried meals, took turns sleeping in hammocks, and ran flight checks every 2 hours. The temperature of the spacecraft ranged from 280 degrees in direct sunlight to minus 250 in shadow. On July 19th, they fired the service propulsion engine and slipped into lunar orbit. Below them stretched a world no human eye had ever seen up close, the far side of the moon, gray, cratered, utterly silent. On July 20th, Armstrong and Aldrin crawled through a narrow tunnel into the lunar module Eagle. Collins, alone in Columbia, would orbit the moon while they descended. If something went wrong, Collins could not help them. If the ascent engine failed, there would be no rescue. As Eagle separated from Columbia, Collins radioed, "You cats take it easy on the lunar surface." Armstrong replied, "See you later." The Eagle began its powered descent, and for the next 12 minutes, everything that could go wrong did. At 6,000 feet above the lunar surface, the computer screamed. "Program alarm," Armstrong reported, his voice flat as glass. "It's a 1202. No one in the history of spaceflight had ever seen a 1202 alarm during a powered descent. It meant the guidance computer was overloaded, drowning in more data than it could process. In Mission Control, a 26-year-old engineer named Steve Bales had seconds to make a decision that would determine whether the landing continued or aborted. Bales checked his reference cards. His heart was hammering. The room was silent. "We're go on that alarm," Bales said. The descent continued, but the worst was yet to come. Armstrong looked out the window and saw death. The computer was steering Eagle directly toward a boulder field the size of a football stadium. Rocks the size of automobiles littered the planned landing zone. If a single landing pad touched one, Eagle would tip over, stranding them on the moon forever. Armstrong grabbed the hand controller and switched to manual. He was now flying the lunar module himself, a vehicle he had practiced in a simulator but never actually piloted to a planetary surface. No one had. Mission Control called the fuel, 60 seconds. That meant 60 seconds of fuel before they had to abort or crash. Armstrong said nothing. He flew. 30 seconds. Still nothing from Armstrong. His heart rate, normally around 60, hit 150. The fuel gauge dropped towards zero. Aldrin called out altitude and speed in a steady monotone. 40 feet, picking up some dust. 30 feet, drifting right. Then, contact light. A 3-foot probe dangling from Eagle's landing pad had touched the moon. Armstrong's voice came through the static. "Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed." In Mission Control, Charlie Duke replied, his voice cracking with emotion. "Roger, Tranquility. We copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. Thanks a lot." Around the world, 600 million people exhaled at the same time. 2 human beings were sitting on the surface of the moon. 6 hours later, Armstrong descended a 9-rung ladder and stepped off the footpad. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. His boot sank a 1/4 inch into fine gray powder that had never been disturbed in 4 billion years. He described the surface as fine and powdery. The sky above was absolute black, no atmosphere to scatter light, no blue, no clouds, just black. 19 minutes later, Aldrin joined him. He looked across the barren, airless plain and spoke 2 words that have defined lunar exploration ever since: magnificent desolation. For 2 hours and 31 minutes, they planted an American flag, collected 47 pounds of lunar samples, deployed scientific instruments, and took photographs that would become the most reproduced images in human history. They spoke briefly with President Nixon via telephone, the longest long-distance call ever made. Then they climbed back inside Eagle and sealed the hatch. Behind them, their boot prints remained in the dust. Undisturbed by wind or rain, they are still there today. The ascent engine fired perfectly. Eagle rose from the moon's surface, leaving behind the descent stage, the flag, the instruments, and those boot prints. They docked with Columbia, where Collins had orbited alone for 21 hours, the loneliest human being in history, cut off from all contact with Earth every time he passed behind the moon. On July 24th, the command module Columbia splashed down in the Pacific Ocean, 8 days, 3 hours, and 18 minutes after liftoff. The recovery ship USS Hornet was waiting. 3 men in biological isolation suits stepped out of the capsule, waving to the cameras. President Nixon, watching from behind a quarantine window, grinned and said, "This is the greatest week in the history of the world since the creation." Apollo 11 was more than a mission. It was proof that when humanity commits to something extraordinary, truly commits, with resources, courage, and the acceptance of terrible risk, it can transcend the limits of what seems possible. 12 humans have walked on the moon. All of them went between 1969 and 1972. No one has been back since. The lunar module Eagle's descent stage still sits in the Sea of Tranquility, alongside a plaque that reads, "Here men from the planet Earth first set foot upon the moon." July 1969 AD, we came in peace for all mankind, and in the dust beside it, undisturbed for over half a century, 2 sets of bootprints point toward a ladder that is no longer there. This has been Of the World, Missions Beyond Earth. Look up tonight. The universe is still out there, waiting.